The whisper was barely audible over the rustle of turning pages and the low hum of the library's old heating system. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft and hesitant. "Is this seat taken?" The man did not look up from the sleek, dark laptop where his fingers rested, unnervingly still. He was a statue of coiled tension in a world of quiet study, his black suit impossibly sharp against the worn oak of the public library table. Every other chair was occupied, a sea of students hunched over textbooks and glowing screens. Only this one, beside him, remained empty. Chloe stood there, the worn straps of her heavy backpack digging into the shoulders of her favorite red wool sweater, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, with dark hair and eyes that, even unseen, felt like they could strip a person down to their bones. A long, faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, a detail that spoke of a life far removed from this dusty sanctuary of knowledge. When he finally lifted his head, the low, ambient noise of the room seemed to fall away. His gaze wasn't unkind, but it was intensely analytical, as if he were calculating the weight and measure of her simple request. Chloe felt a blush creep up her neck, suddenly conscious of her faded blue jeans and the sheer exhaustion she knew was written all over her face. For a long moment he said nothing. He just watched her, and in that silence, she felt an instinct, primal and deep, that this was not a man one disturbed lightly. But her anatomy final was in 2 days, her apartment was cold, and this was the last free seat in the entire building. She held his gaze, her own quiet desperation a shield. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he inclined his head toward the chair. Just a single, minimalist gesture.
No es my.
No word. It was permission and it was a dismissal. Chloe murmured a quiet thank you and slid into the chair, carefully pulling her heavy textbook from her bag. She arranged her pens, her notebook, her entire world of frantic study beside his silent, dangerous one. As she opened the book to the intricate diagrams of a human heart, she could feel the sheer intensity of his presence beside her, a low-frequency hum of power. She was a 19-year-old nursing student, broke and bone-tired. He was a mystery. And as she began to trace the pathways of the superior vena cava, she had no way of knowing that this simple question, "Can I sit with you?" had just sealed her fate, binding her life to a man whose name was whispered with fear in the darkest corners of the city. What she did not know was that he was not just a man. He was an emperor in a hidden kingdom, and she had just sat down at his right hand. Welcome to our channel. If you enjoy stories about unexpected connections and the quiet courage that changes everything, be sure to subscribe. Now, let us get back to the story. Chloe's life was a carefully balanced equation of exhaustion and determination. Her world was small, contained within the triangle of her cramped apartment, the bustling city hospital where she took her nursing classes, and this public library, her only refuge from the cold. The apartment she shared with her 14-year-old sister, Lila, had faulty heating and paint that peeled from the walls, but it was home. Lila was the reason for everything. Born with a congenital heart defect, she was the sun around which Chloe's entire universe orbited. Every late night spent memorizing the branches of the nervous system, every extra shift she picked up at the campus diner, was for Lila. It was to ensure that one day, she would be the nurse who could understand, who could comfort, who could make sure no family ever felt as lost and powerless as theirs had. That afternoon, tucked into an envelope slid under their door, was a formal notice. A development corporation had purchased their building, and all tenants were being offered a paltry buyout to vacate within 60 days. The letter was filled with cold, legal language, but its message was simple: get out. Chloe had stared at it, the paper trembling in her hand, a cold dread washing over her that had nothing to do with the apartment's chill. This was their home. Their neighbors were elderly, on fixed incomes, people who had lived there for decades. Where would they go? Where would she and Lila go? The thought was a physical weight, pressing down on her as she tried to focus on her studies. That was why she was in the library, seeking not just quiet, but a temporary escape from the crushing reality waiting for her at home. She traced the muscles of the forearm in her textbook, her mind a frantic buzz. The man beside her hadn't moved in over an hour. His focus was absolute, his screen filled with columns of numbers and what looked like shipping manifests. He never took a call, never shifted in his seat. He simply worked, a portrait of immense, unshakable control. Chloe risked a glance at him. Who was he? A businessman? A consultant? There was a stillness about him that was more intimidating than any overt display of power. It was the stillness of a predator, perfectly at ease at the top of the food chain. She shook her head, forcing her attention back to her book. She didn't have time for mysteries. She had to study. She had to pass. She had to find a way to fight an eviction notice from a faceless corporation, and she had to make sure Lila never saw the fear in her eyes. It was a heavy load to carry, heavier than any textbook. She took a deep breath, picked up her pen, and began to write, the scratching of the nib on paper a small act of defiance against the silence and the fear. The next day, the chair was empty. Chloe felt a strange, illogical pang of disappointment, which she immediately dismissed as foolishness. She spread her books out, grateful for the extra space, and dove into her work. The library was her sanctuary, and she needed it now more than ever. Around mid-afternoon, a commotion erupted near the front circulation desk. Two brash young men, reeking of cheap cologne and entitlement, were harassing a younger student, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16. They had his phone and were tossing it back and forth, laughing as he pleaded for them to give it back. The librarian, Mrs. Gable, a kind woman with silver hair and a firm voice, tried to intervene. "That's enough, boys. Give him back his property and leave," one of them sneered at her. "Or what, Grandma? You gonna shush us to death?" Chloe's head snapped up. Something inside her, the nascent core of the nurse she was becoming, refused to stay silent. It was the instinct to protect, to shield the vulnerable. She stood up, her heart pounding, and walked over. "Give him his phone," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. The two men turned to her, their amusement shifting to disdain as they took in her plus-sized frame and simple clothes. "Look what we got here," one of them said, looking her up and down. "Mind your own business." Chloe stood her ground, placing herself slightly in front of the terrified boy. "You're causing a disturbance." He asked for his phone back. "Give it to him, and you can go." The second man took a step closer, trying to intimidate her with his height. "And who's gonna make us?" What no one saw was the man in the black suit who had entered the library moments before and was now standing silently in the shadow of a tall bookshelf. Minjun had come back for a document he'd left behind, but he stopped when he saw Chloe rise from her table. He watched her place her body between the aggressors and the victim, saw the lack of fear in her eyes, replaced by a solid, immovable resolve. He saw her chin lift. She did not raise her voice. She did not posture. She simply stood as a barrier. "I'm not going to make you do anything," Chloe said calmly. "But Mrs. Gable is going to call security. They'll call the police. You'll have a record for theft and harassment, all over a joke that isn't funny." It doesn't seem worth it. For a second, it seemed her words wouldn't work. Then, the first man shrugged, tossed the phone onto the desk, and they sauntered out, laughing. Chloe immediately turned to the boy. "Are you all right?" He nodded, grabbing his phone, his hands shaking. "Thank you." After he hurried away, Mrs. Gable put a hand on Chloe's arm. "That was a brave thing to do, dear." Chloe just shook her head, her adrenaline starting to fade. It was the right thing to do. She turned to go back to her table and nearly collided with the man from yesterday. Minjun was standing right there. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding an expression she couldn't decipher. "That was unwise," he said, his voice a low baritone. But effective. He held out a small, black flash drive. "You left this at the table yesterday." Chloe blinked, confused. "Oh, that's not mine." Minjun's expression didn't change, but he looked from the flash drive to her, then back. He simply nodded, pocketing it. "My mistake." And then he was gone, leaving Chloe with a lingering echo of his voice and the strange feeling that she had just been tested and, somehow, had passed. Chloe left the library just as the sun was setting, the sky streaked with orange and purple. She pulled her red sweater tighter around herself, the evening air carrying a sharp bite. The relief she'd felt inside had evaporated, replaced by the familiar anxiety about her apartment and Lila. As she turned onto the quieter side street that led to her bus stop, two figures stepped out from an alleyway, blocking her path. It was the same two men from the library. Well, the first one said, a malicious grin spreading across his face. Look who it is. Miss Save the Day. Chloe's stomach clenched. The street was empty, the storefronts dark. I don't want any trouble, she said, trying to keep her voice even. The second one laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. A little late for that, isn't it? You embarrassed us in there. We don't like being embarrassed. He took a step forward, and Chloe took an involuntary step back, her bag slipping from her shoulder and hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. Her textbooks, her notes, her entire academic life lay at their feet. The first man gestured to his friend. She thinks she's tough. Let's see how tough she is when she's got nothing. He bent down, reaching for her bag. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She could be replaced, but those books, that work, represented her only way out. Suddenly, the silent street was filled with the purr of a high-end engine. A long, black sedan, so dark it seemed to absorb the light from the street lamps, glided to a stop beside them. The windows were tinted, impenetrable. The two men froze, their bravado vanishing in an instant. The back door opened, but no one got out. Instead, a man in a tailored gray suit emerged from the driver's side. He didn't look at Chloe. He didn't say a word. He simply fixed his gaze on the two thugs, a look of profound boredom on his face. The message was clear. The air crackled with unspoken threat. The man who had been reaching for Chloe's bag slowly straightened up. He looked from the silent driver to the dark, imposing car, and a flicker of genuine fear crossed his face. He and his friend exchanged a nervous glance, then backed away slowly, before turning and practically running down the street. The driver watched them go, then his eyes flickered to Chloe for a brief, dismissive moment. He got back in the car. Through the dark glass of the rear window, Chloe could just make out a silhouette. A man, sitting perfectly still, watching her. It was him. He had been in the car the whole time. The sedan pulled away from the curb as silently as it had arrived, disappearing into the city traffic, leaving Chloe alone on the sidewalk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was safe, but she felt a new kind of fear, colder and more profound than before. She had been protected, but by what? She slowly bent down, her hands shaking, and began to gather her scattered books. The encounter on the street left a residue of fear that clung to Chloe for days. Every time she walked home, she found herself looking over her shoulder, her senses on high alert. But more unnerving than the memory of the two thugs was the memory of the black car and the silent, powerful man inside it. He hadn't been at the library since, and his absence was as loud as his presence had been. A week later, a man in a suit far too expensive for their building knocked on her door. He wasn't the process server. He was someone else, someone smoother, with a predatory smile and eyes that didn't blink. He introduced himself as a representative for the development corporation. He sat at their small kitchen table, Lila having thankfully been at a friend's house, and laid out his proposal. The offer in the letter was a formality, Miss Evans, he said, his voice slick as oil. For a young woman in your position with responsibilities, we understand that a little more incentive might be required. He slid a thick envelope across the table. Chloe didn't touch it. What is this? She asked. That is $50,000, he said, leaning back. Cash. It's yours. All you have to do is sign an agreement to vacate and, more importantly, speak to your neighbors. Convince them to take the deal. Tell them it's the best they're going to get. You'd be a community leader. The money was a staggering sum.
It was a lifeline.
It was Lila's future medical bills paid. It was a new apartment in a safe building. It was an end to the constant, grinding worry that was her life. All she had to do was sell out her neighbors. She thought of Mrs. Rodriguez in 2B, who baked her cookies and had lived there since the 70s. She thought of Mr. Henderson in 3A, a retired postal worker who spent his days tending to the flower boxes on his windowsill. Their lives would be upended, their small, fragile world shattered. The man watched her, his smile confident. He thought he had her. He saw a poor girl in a worn sweater and assumed her principles were as cheap as her clothes. Chloe looked from the envelope to his smug face. She pushed the envelope back across the table.
"No," she said.
The man's smile faltered. "I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," Chloe interrupted, her voice low but firm. "You want me to scare my neighbors into giving up their homes, so you can make a profit. The answer is no. Their homes are not for sale. And neither am I." She stood up. "Please leave." The man's face hardened, the slick veneer cracking to reveal something ugly underneath. "You're making a very big mistake, little girl," he hissed. He snatched the envelope and left, slamming the door behind him. Chloe sank into a chair, her body trembling not with fear, but with a strange, fierce pride. She had been offered a way out and had chosen to stay in the storm on principle. Miles away, in a penthouse office overlooking the entire city, Minjun listened to a report from one of his lieutenants. The agent made the offer. 50,000. She refused. The lieutenant sounded surprised. Minjun did not. He looked out at the glittering city lights, his expression unreadable. He had seen her stand up to 2 thugs for a stranger. He was not surprised she would stand up to a corporation for her neighbors. He was, however, deeply impressed. Retaliation was swift and cruel. 2 days after Chloe refused the bribe, the heating in their entire building went out. The landlord claimed a part was on backorder, an obvious lie orchestrated by the new owners. A brutal cold snap had descended on the city, and their small apartment became an icebox. Chloe layered blankets on Lila, who was more susceptible to the cold, and boiled water on the stove just to bring some warmth into the air. Then came the new notices, posted on every door. Allegations of code violations, fabricated and absurd, as a pretext for a mass eviction. Panic began to ripple through the building. Neighbors who had been determined to fight now looked defeated. Chloe felt a rising tide of despair. She was failing them. She was failing Lila. She couldn't study at home. It was too cold to think, too stressful to focus. Her only option was the library. She bundled up, leaving Lila with Mrs. Rodriguez, and walked the frozen blocks to the one place that felt like a sanctuary. She was exhausted, emotionally and physically. The weight of it all was crushing her. As she walked through the doors, the blessed wave of warmth hit her, and for a moment, she closed her eyes in sheer relief. She made her way to her usual section, her head down, her mind already on the chapter she needed to master. And then she saw him. He was there, at their table, as if he had never been away. Minjun was looking at his laptop, but his focus seemed different this time. As she approached, he looked up, and his eyes immediately found hers. For the first time, his gaze wasn't just analytical. It held something else. Recognition. He took in her pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she hugged her sweater to herself not for comfort, but for warmth. He saw her defeat. Chloe stopped at the edge of the table, not knowing what to do or say. She hadn't come here for him, but now that he was here, a desperate, foolish part of her felt a flicker of hope. He broke the silence, his voice low and direct, cutting through all pretense. "You're cold," he stated, not a question. She could only nod, her throat tight. He closed his laptop with a quiet, decisive click. The sound seemed to finalize a decision. He stood up, a towering, imposing figure in the quiet library. He looked down at her, his expression serious, intense. "What is the name of the man who owns your building?" he asked. It wasn't a casual question. It was a demand. It was an offer of help so profound and so dangerous that it stole the air from her lungs. In that moment, Chloe understood that this man was the furthest thing from a simple businessman. He was power, and he was offering to wield it for her. He didn't wait for an answer in the library. Instead, he simply said, "Come with me," and started walking toward the exit. Chloe, caught in the pull of his authority and her own desperation, followed without a second thought. He led her not to the gleaming black sedan, but to a small, unassuming coffee shop a few blocks away. The windows were steamy, the inside filled with the warm, rich scent of coffee and pastries. It was quiet, intimate. He guided her to a secluded booth in the back and spoke to the owner in rapid, fluent Korean. A moment later, 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate and a plate of warm pastries were placed on their table. He hadn't asked what she wanted. He just seemed to know. "Drink," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You need to get warm." Chloe wrapped her freezing hands around the thick ceramic mug, the heat a blissful shock. For a few minutes, they sat in silence as she drank, the warmth slowly seeping into her bones, chasing away the deep chill. He watched her, his patience infinite. Finally, he spoke again. "The man who is buying your building. His name is Alistair Finch." It wasn't a question. He knew. Chloe looked up, startled.
How?
"How did you know that?" Minjun ignored the question. "Tell me about your sister," he said instead, his gaze dropping to the small, worn silver locket that always rested at her throat. His change of topic was disarming. Unconsciously, her hand went to the locket. "Her name is Lila," Chloe found herself saying, the words tumbling out. "She's 14. She has a heart condition. That's why I'm studying to be a nurse. I want to be able to help people like her." He listened, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. He wasn't just hearing the words. He was absorbing them. It was the most anyone had truly listened to her in a very long time. "You are a good sister," he said, a simple statement of fact. "You are a good person. You stood up for a stranger. You refused money to protect your neighbors. In a world of compromises, you do not compromise." Chloe felt a blush rise to her cheeks, not of embarrassment this time, but of something else. He saw her. In a way no one else ever had, this dangerous, enigmatic man saw the very core of who she was trying to be. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered, the question she had been holding back. He held her gaze for a long moment, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his controlled exterior. She saw a flicker of something ancient and deep, a pain that was startling in its intensity. "Because Alistair Finch is not just your enemy," Minjun said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He is also mine." Here is the part of the story nobody saw coming. Not the residents of the cold apartment building, not the slick corporate agent, and certainly not Chloe Evans as she sat in that warm cafe. The connection between the Korean Mafia boss and the nursing student wasn't a coincidence born in a library. It was the echo of a tragedy that had happened 2 decades earlier. Minjun's father had not been a crime lord. He had been a brilliant and honest logistics entrepreneur in Seoul, the owner of a thriving shipping company. His partner, his trusted friend, was a charismatic American financier named Alistair Finch. Together, they built an empire. But Finch was a man hollowed out by greed. He systematically created a shadow corporation, siphoning funds, forging documents, and leveraging the company's assets for his own personal gain. When the empire was on the verge of collapse, Finch framed Minjun's father for the entire fraud, providing manufactured evidence to the authorities. Ruined, disgraced, and facing a lifetime in prison for crimes he did not commit, Minjun's father took his own life. Minjun was only a boy, but he remembered everything. He remembered Finch's false sympathy at the funeral. He remembered the loss of his home, his future, his father's honor. The legitimate world had failed his family. So, he turned to the one that operated by a different set of rules. He was taken in by his uncle, the head of a powerful gaipa, a criminal organization. He learned their ways, not with a thirst for violence, but with a cold, methodical desire for one thing: justice for his father. He rose through the ranks with his sharp intellect and unshakable will, eventually taking control. For 10 years, he had hunted Alistair Finch, who had vanished after the betrayal, laundering his stolen fortune and reinventing himself in America. Minjun's hunt had finally led him here, to this city, where Finch was operating through a series of shell corporations, including the one buying up inner-city real estate. The library wasn't a random location. It was a strategic vantage point, chosen for its proximity to a small office Finch used. Minjun had been there for weeks, gathering the final pieces of his decade-long puzzle. He had never planned for Chloe. She was a variable he couldn't have predicted. A girl in a red sweater who needed a place to study and, with a simple, whispered question, sat down in the middle of his carefully laid war. When he learned that her building was one of Finch's targets, the two separate threads of his life, the vengeful past and the unexpected present, pulled together into a single, undeniable knot. Her fight was now his fight. He took everything from my father, Minjun told her, his voice tight with controlled emotion. His business, his name, his life. I have been searching for him for a very long time. His greed has now brought him to your door. This is where it ends. The fall of Alistair Finch was not a bloody affair. It was silent, precise, and devastating. Minjun did not operate with bombs and bullets. He operated with information, the one currency more powerful than money. While Finch saw Chloe as a minor obstacle, a poor girl in a poor building, Minjun saw her as the moral justification for the war he was about to unleash. His people, a network of hackers, accountants, and informants, moved with surgical efficiency. They leaked documents to financial regulators, exposing decades of fraud and money laundering. They provided anonymous tips to investigative journalists, complete with untraceable evidence of Finch's shell corporations and illegal real estate tactics. They found Finch's hidden offshore accounts and, with a few keystrokes, froze his access to the fortune he had built on betrayal. Within a week, Finch's empire crumbled. He was a man facing federal indictments, civil lawsuits, and the complete collapse of his carefully constructed life. The pressure on Chloe's building vanished overnight. The development deal was dead. The heating was miraculously fixed the next day. The eviction notices were rescinded with a formal, groveling apology from a management company that no longer answered to Finch. Chloe's neighbors celebrated, hailing her as a hero who had somehow stood up to the corporate giant and won. They never knew the invisible army that had fought on their behalf. A few weeks later, Chloe received a letter from the hospital where Lila was treated. It informed her that an anonymous benefactor had established a substantial endowment fund specifically for pediatric cardiac care. The fund would cover all of Lila's current and future medical expenses for life. Chloe sat on her bed, the letter in her lap, and cried. They were tears not of sorrow, but of overwhelming, unbelievable relief. The weight she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. She knew, without a doubt, who the anonymous benefactor was. He came to the library one last time. It was late, the room nearly empty. He sat across from her, not beside her. "It is done," he said. "He will harm no one else." Chloe looked at him, her heart full of a gratitude so immense she couldn't find words for it. "Thank you," she whispered. It felt so inadequate. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Your sister will be taken care of. You will be a great nurse. You have a protector's heart." He stood to leave. "I have to go now. My work in this city is finished." A pang of loss, sharp and unexpected, hit Chloe. Will I ever see you again?" she asked, her voice small.
Mignon Post.
He reached into his pocket and placed a small, simple black card on the table. It had only a phone number on it. No name. No other information. "If you ever need me," he said, "I will come." And then he walked away, disappearing out the library doors and out of her life, leaving behind a kept promise and the possibility of another. A year passed. The seasons turned, and life, once a frantic struggle for survival, settled into a peaceful, hopeful rhythm. Chloe was no longer just a student. She was at the top of her nursing program, her professors marveling at her blend of clinical skill and profound empathy. She moved with a confidence she had never known, free from the crushing weight of financial fear. Lila was thriving. With the best care, her health had stabilized, and she was a vibrant, happy teenager, her laughter filling their small, warm apartment. The building was safe, now owned by a tenant cooperative they had formed with the help of a pro bono lawyer Minjun's organization had discreetly arranged. The community Chloe had refused to betray had become her fortress. Sometimes, she would sit in the library at the same old oak table, her new textbooks open before her. The memory of the man in the black suit felt like a dream, a noir film she had stumbled into and then out of. But the evidence of his presence was everywhere, in Lila's healthy smile, in the deed to their building, in the quiet peace that had settled over her life. She kept the black card with a single phone number tucked into a worn copy of her anatomy textbook. She had never used it. She didn't need to. His final act had not been to bind her to him, but to set her free. His protection was not a cage, but a gift that had allowed her to build her own life, on her own terms. This evening, as the library emptied out, Chloe found herself looking at the empty chair beside her, the place where the Emperor had sat. She remembered the terror, the tension, the strange, unexpected tenderness. She remembered whispering, "Can I sit with you?" and changing her world forever. She pulled out her phone, not to call, but just to look. She had saved the number under a single name, Minjun. A quiet smile touched her lips. He had told her he would come if she needed him, but she had discovered a strength in herself she never knew she possessed. She didn't need a protector anymore. What she felt now was something different, a quiet ache of longing for the man who saw her, truly saw her, and recognized a kindred spirit in her stubborn, principled heart. The story wasn't over. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this was just the end of the first chapter. The empty chair beside her was not a void. It was a promise, waiting to be kept. What do you think Chloe should do? Should she call him, or should she wait for fate to bring them together again? I love reading your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories about love, courage, and the hidden connections that define us. I read every comment. I will see you in the next story.